So yeah, I've started recording. Thank you for coming today. We're joined today by one of our directors, Brian Horn, who'll be taking us through CASLO qualifications, design, delivery, and awards. Brian, I'll hand over to you, and I'll be here to support if you need me.
Okay, thanks, Amajit. As Amajit said, my name's Brian Horn. I'm one of the directors at OCN London, and today we're going to talk through a new terminology, CASLO, but hopefully we'll unpack that in today's presentation and talk through what it means both for providers but also for awarding organisations delivering these qualifications. So what does CASLO stand for? Well, CASLO, the name came around from a raft of research activity that Ofqual undertook. And CASLO stands for Confirming the Acquisition of Specified Learning Outcomes. Now, that's quite a mouthful. And for those of you who've probably been around a while, as I have, people might be calling them things like credit-based qualifications. They might be referring to the qualification and credit framework, and they might also be referring to national vocational qualifications. But in essence, CASLO qualifications are a wraparound terminology for a raft of qualifications that have learning outcomes, assessment criteria, and they're based on mastery. So the key features of these qualifications are they are normally unit-based, they will tend to have a vocational focus, and they will be based on mastery, which I'll talk through in a little while. And they're also flexible with a credit-based structure. So in the old terminology, I think we used to talk about things like rules of combination, and we used to attach a single credit to 10 hours. So there's quite an established lexicon in this space. But CASLO, in terms of Ofqual, is an attempt to bring them all together under one terminology and say, how are we going to regulate these qualifications and what do we expect from awarding organisations? So OCN London are amongst many who offer CASLO qualifications, and there's some qualification guides from our suite of qualifications. This is the construction sector, but you'll see there that they're at different levels, they're at different sizes. Their diplomas, their awards, their certificates, but they're all in different sectors, subsectors of the construction offer. So when we're designing a CASLO qualification, how do we start? Well, I think there's three main areas that we need to look at in this Venn diagram. There's the pedagogy, which is how is the curriculum actually taught? So going back to the specifications, how is the material in the specifications actually taught in the lesson? That's the green area. The curriculum is the breadth and depth of the content in terms of how much is being taught and how much is being learnt and expected to be learnt and assessed. And then the assessment is a methodology to assess that, having been taught a range of material, the learner has an awareness and a knowledge, a skill and understanding that can be tested. And it's in this overlap area, this yellow portion of this diagram here, where qualifications are designed. So in many cases, you can see there that qualifications can be taught all and assessed in part, and similarly with the actual teaching content. So the level of overlap there determines how the assessment is structured. Now, in CASLO qualifications, a key word is mastery, and most of these qualifications will involve learners getting to the point where they understand completely what is being asked of them. The skills are in their hands and they have the prescribed level of knowledge. So in order to do that, in order to make mastery a real thing, the domain of learning needs to be set out. So the learning objectives need to be comprehensive so that you can define a learner before the qualification and a learner having taken the qualification, what the objective is. Normally, mastery is the domain of all the intended learning outcomes. So for CASLO qualifications, you are normally looking for 100% coverage of all the learning outcomes. And each of those is then clarified in terms of individual assessment criteria so that students can be tested in terms of their mastery of the learning outcomes. And this terminology, particularly the Bloom's taxonomy, is really important to be thinking through in terms of qualifications as to where the level is pitched in terms of knowledge, skills and understanding to achieve mastery in a specific area. The one I always think of is, funnily enough, is carpentry. If you're hanging a door at level 2, you need to be able to do that, but do it under supervision. Whereas at level 3, you've got sufficient mastery of the skill to be able to do that without supervision. So the level, again, is an important terminology in terms of mastery and how this fits into the CASLO qual design. Okay. So how do we start with designing qualifications that fit within the CASLO framework? And I acknowledge here that this is an Ofqual diagram, but it's probably the best diagram that I've seen to explain how qualifications are put together and structured. At stage 1, a designer of a qualification in an awarding organisation will set out a profile of what needs to be done. So I go back to my carpentry example. If you're looking at a level 2 carpentry qualification, then one of the purposes is to be able to hang a door, as I've just said. If, however, you're not that worried about them working independently, that you know that as a level 2 operative you'll be working under supervision, then the purpose would be to hang a door in a supervised environment. Whereas if you want the role to be more independent and at a higher level, then the purpose would be, that would be the purpose. So therefore you'd be looking at hanging a door, in my example, without supervision. So it's this stage where all that thought processes are worked through, stage 1. That then gives us a set of target proficiencies. So in order to be able to do those things that have been defined, and normally we would be working with employers, we'd be working with training providers, we'd be working with sector bodies here to define what is needed for the qualification. We get to a target proficiency, and that allows us to model out what we think it looks like in terms of a target. So a carpenter should be able to do X, they should be able to do Y, they should be able to do Z. From that point, it is then about coming up with what is in essence the model for the proficiency. So for instance, at this target stage, not everything goes through to the proficiency model. So it might well be that you start with 15 core outcomes that you're looking at in terms of target proficiency, but you decide at the end of the day for a level 2 qualification that you probably only need 10 of them, in which case that's the 10 that you settle upon. Now this is an iterative process, so this is the purpose of this red arrow here. Clearly this needs checking back with the employer group or the stakeholder group that have been developing the qualification. So the model needs to be taken back to the group and say, right, you came up with an idea as to the prioritized purpose of this qual. You came out with this suggested set of outcomes. We think the proficiency model looks like this. So it's at this stage that the early doors visibility of the learning outcomes will be scrutinized. And it might well be that you go round this loop a couple of times before you get to a model that the employers and the stakeholders at stage 1 are happy to sign off. When they are happy to sign off, then stage 2, effectively the model becomes fixed. And it's at that point that you build a specification. Now, clearly, once you've defined this model, once you've defined the learning outcomes, you can then work on how you actually assess those particular aspects. So it's at that stage that you build up a set of assessment criteria alongside guidance and assessment methodology. So going back to OCN London, we are a leading Ofqual regulated awarding body. We operate out of London. We have national coverage, and we have a full suite of qualifications again across most sectors. Significant numbers of our qualifications are CASLO based. They're flexible, they're unit based, and we also offer a range of support. This webinar being part of that support, but we offer support through our quality assurance and other vehicles for centres and individuals who are taking such qualifications. Here's on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see how learning outcomes would be unpacked typically in some of our qualifications. So if the learning outcome, for instance, in the first example, is that the learner will be able to communicate electronically, then you need to be able to assess that. First things first, though, it's worth pointing out the verbs and the nouns and the way that sentence is structured. So the learner will be able to communicate. It's at a certain level. If you look at the Bloom's taxonomy and you go up, then you could make that stronger and stronger and higher. You could have words like evaluate and analyze, etc., etc. But in this case, it is a simple task. The learner will be able to communicate. Now, in order to do that, again, unpacking that, communicate electronically, send, receive, and forward emails. That's a key aspect of electronic communications. And then the second part is prepare and send a clear and accurate text message. So again, those assessment criteria assess that learning outcome. Now, it might well be that you could consult with an employer group or others and say there are other methods. But in essence, those are the two main methods that you would look to test in an assessment criteria. And from that, you can then build assessments that would test whether a learner will be able to do that. I mean, clearly, in terms of prepare and send a clear and accurate text message, you would ask the learner to do that. And then you could sign that off as being something that they were able to do. Another one, the learner will be able to use the internet securely. Again, a very simple, low-level, use the internet, and the qualification there is to use it securely. So logging onto the internet is the basic task that needs to be done. And then awareness of security needs to be demonstrated. So again, it would be a case of checking the web address, etc., etc. And again, these things can be assessed. And these are the type of things that for OCN London we have in our digital skills qualifications and quite a lot of our IT-based qualifications, but they do illustrate how the learner outcomes are unpacked in that way. So looking at the features of these qualifications, there's a lot of common features across the piece. And the key aspects that I would point to is they're very analytical in the way that they are written. So they are also comprehensively written. So the learning outcomes are very tightly written. And if you look at our specifications, you'll see that there's no unnecessary verbs, adjectives, nouns, and there's no room for confusion. A learning outcome should be very clear as to what is required of the learner, and then the assessment criteria should equally pull out very clearly the method of assessing that learning outcome. They're defined conjunctively, and what we mean by that is they're meant to be looked at as a whole next to each other, so that the units are looked at, and in many instances they're looked at and delivered holistically. So they don't stand alone. So the important part of a CASLO qualification is to look at the materials and read the whole way through. It will be poor practice to look at a qualification and go, page 1, I'll teach that, page 2, I'll now teach that, etc., etc. You really do need to look through the whole of the qualification and look at how it all fits together, because that's the way they're designed. They are assessed exhaustively. So when an assessment criteria makes a comment that a learner can do something, then that does need to be assessed. And it needs to be assessed in a confirmatory fashion, i.e. that you know that the learner can do that and you've tested that. It's really important to note that when you are delivering these qualifications and when you're looking at them, you do need to look at the assessment criteria and virtually one by one say, yes, we can do that, we can do that, we can do that. And the learner is able to do those things. Now, just going back to Ofqual, Ofqual have carried out a range of research into CASLO, into their design and how they operate. And what they have done is they've looked at how CASLO qualifications work in relation to classical qualifications. They've looked back at the origins of into vocational training. It goes back way back into the days of indentured apprenticeships and things like that. And they've also looked at the criticism of CASLO qualifications. I would urge you to have a look at those two key research documents, although there are a range. I think there's about 10 documents. How CASLO works is a particularly useful document to get an understanding of how an awarding organisation builds these qualifications. So looking at the comparison then, they are basically, in the main, they tend to be centre assessed, and they tend to have multiple units. And it will be impossible for an awarding organisation to scrutinise every single component during every particular cycle. And that contrasts quite dramatically with GQs, which in most part have a single address assessed component and externally assessed examinations. Clearly, with CASLO, you're looking at discrete learning outcomes, which are mastery based. Whereas with classical qualifications, it's more holistic with grading. The other big difference with classical qualifications, such as GCSE and A-level, is the whole of the subject content will be taught and a proportion of it will be assessed. So it's compensatory assessment, whereas a CASLO qualification is non-compensatory in that all aspects would need to be assessed. An important focus of CASLO qualifications is how awarding organisations are accountable for the safe award and the quality of these qualifications. So it brings to the fore the internal quality assurance arrangements and the external quality assurance arrangements, particularly internal and external moderation. And in terms of OCN London, there's a number of webinars that we're going to undertake over the next few months. And also there's a range of webinars around our EQA approach and our Quartz web system. So if you look out for those, you can pick up on those details. So looking at the EQA role then, you can look at it as a sequence. If you start on the left-hand side, you have your unassessed learner evidence that a learner might have produced. You then have internal assessment and internal quality assurance, where a centre is at that point pulling that evidence together, looking at it, signing it off as being achieved against the assessment criteria. It is then in our system put forward for certification using the ERAC system. And it's at that stage where our quality engagement team would kick in and they would carry out verification of the work that's been signed off. So we have a process for quality assurance, and it's very similar to that adopted across all awarding organisations. But nevertheless, it is our methodology to assure CASLO qualifications in terms of the safety of the award. So where do we go now in terms of our future with CASLO? I think CASLO is a word that's here to stay. It's a little bit of an awkward word. I appreciate that. But we are looking broadly at our offer. We're looking at digital badges. We're looking at micro-credentials, for instance. And how does that fit with our understanding of CASLO qualifications? We're also looking quite closely at Ofqual's guidance, and there is a significant amount of guidance, particularly around the use of AI for CASLO qualifications in terms of work that's being produced by learners. And we are committed, as ever, to produce materials that allow for inclusive learning and also learning that will make an impact. So we'll continue to keep these under review. We'll continue to keep Ofqual's research under review. And obviously, one of the most important things is we'll continue to consult with providers, with partners such as yourselves, about our offering in this space and how it's properly quality assured. So, to conclude, in the last slide here, CASLO qualifications are flexible, they're mastery based, and they are vital for vocational training. And we have OCN London, I think something in the region of 350 qualifications on the register, and a significant proportion of our qualifications fall into this CASLO category. We also are looking closely and following Ofqual's research programme, and indeed we've taken part in 1 or 2 sessions with the Ofqual team, but it does highlight the unique design and the quality assurance needs for these qualifications. And you can expect this terminology, CASLO, to be used much more significantly and much more commonly now across our correspondence and our descriptions of these qualifications. And we do lead, not the sector, but we lead for our own suite of qualifications in delivering and supporting CASLO qualifications in the way that Ofqual have defined. So I'm going to the end of this now, so I don't know whether we want to take questions at this point.
Sorry, we don't appear to have had any questions come in, so I think at that stage, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, thanks.